It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. When they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 116th season of the Empire Club of Canada. I'm Mike Van Solen. I'm the president of the Empire Club, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's show, a discussion about the World Health Organization. From my home in Toronto to yours, I call this meeting to order. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge from everyone at the Empire Club our deep-felt heartfelt condolences to everybody affected by the senseless massacre and tragedy in Nova Scotia. I know I and my family will be watching the Nova Scotia Remembers vigil tonight. I hope others can join. It certainly has weighed heavily on our hearts. But of course, what happened in Nova Scotia is not the only thing that's occupying the minds of Canadians today. We certainly are also thinking about COVID-19, and we're thinking about the World Health Organization. As Canadians, we tend to think about health authorities that are more local. We think about hospitals, we maybe think about our family doctor, we might think of the Minister of Health. But in COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe, requires a more global outlook. And for that perspective, since 1948, we have turned to the World Health Organization. Many of us may not know this, but the founding Director General of the World Health Organization was a Canadian from Oakville, Dr. Brock Chisholm. His job, and the job of every Director General since, has been promoting and protecting the health of all people. A tall order, and the many, many Canadians who have served the World Health Organization have all worked to help live up to those very high standards and goals. It is in its 70 plus years, the World Health Organization has helped eradicate smallpox and polio in Canada and almost everywhere else in the world. And the World Health Organization has worked to curb the spread of diseases from HIV/AIDS to Ebola. It has established a baseline for healthcare in its member countries for which they all work to live up to. The WHO was not around when the world last faced a pandemic of the scale of COVID-19. And under the immense pressure now, the international health governance body has become a political football. It faces tough questions. Was their advice about COVID-19 right, based on the best evidence and analysis available at the time? Did its member nations promptly share all the information they had? Have members and the WHO lived up to their obligations? Do those members give enough money to the WHO to do its job? And does the WHO use that money effectively? To help us get through these questions and more, we have an all-star panel. Professor Ilona Kickbusch is the founder and chair of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. At the World Health Organization, she was a driving force behind the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion and the WHO's Healthy Cities Network. And Professor Kickbusch has been instrumental in the development of the German Global Health Strategy. Having seen how well Germany has handled the coronavirus outbreak, we're lucky to have her here with us today. Dr. James Orbinski is the inaugural director of York University's Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. He is a doctor, humanitarian, author, an author who served as president of Doctors Without Borders from 1998 to 2001, a period over which they received the Nobel Peace Prize. During this pandemic, he has been lending the government his deep expertise in global public health and helped establish the 400-bed treatment and recovery site for people experiencing homelessness in Toronto. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Orbinski. Dr. Peter Singer is the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization. He is the architect of the WHO's strategy and its $1 billion target. 1 billion more people benefiting from universal health coverage, 1 billion more people better protected from health emergencies, and 1 billion more people enjoying better health and well-being. If there's anyone who can help the organization at this time of crisis, it is Dr. Singer. Today's conversation will be moderated by Danielle, Bochove, a reporter with Bloomberg who previously covered mining and climate. Now, like every other reporter, she is covering COVID-19. There's an opportunity for you to ask questions. There's a question button. Feel free to tap that, and we'll make sure we can get some of those questions, Danielle, to ask of our panel. As well, if you're experiencing any difficulties with the resolution, you can go to a lower resolution, which may help you with that. So with all that, we're looking forward to our discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to get it started.
Mike, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, even virtually. And I also want to thank all of our panelists for making time in the midst of everything that is going on, which is clearly crazy. I'm hoping that in the next hour, we can cover quite a lot of ground, both looking at the WHO in terms of the context of the current crisis, but also beyond that, and also leave some time for some very COVID-specific questions that I think are probably on everyone's minds. And as Mike says, to take some questions from the audience as well. It seems logical, I think, to start with what is probably the most pressing question on everyone's mind who is watching right now. And I'm going to throw this one to you, Peter Singer, first of all, which is, where are we at this point in the trajectory of the pandemic?
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for having me on the panel. Thanks to all our participants. We're at a point where globally there are almost 2.6 million cases that are confirmed, almost 180,000 deaths. And although there's been terrible suffering to date, the worst may be yet to come. Around the world as we ease restrictions and potentially see future waves. And in the low and middle income countries, where the wave of carnage unfortunately looks like it's about to begin. And Danielle, if I may say, for me, it's also personal. I had COVID-19, as did my wife. And so there is obviously also a lot of hope. And while we mourn this terrible carnage, I want to end on the problem statement by emphasizing hope. And the World Health Organization is part of delivering that hope and defeating COVID-19.
And I guess if I stay with you for a second, Peter, I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to have to be around the political football that Mike referenced, right? The debate around the efficacy of the WHO during the COVID-19 crisis is becoming increasingly polarized. There's a lot going on right now. It's early to sort of have the benefit of hindsight, but how do you think the organization has done so far?
Yeah, thank you. My headline is, I think what's happened is the World Health Organization has demonstrated that it's the foundation of the global response, of the international response, and that a strong World Health Organization is needed to defeat COVID-19. Let me just give you 5 quick proof points. Data and early warning. The Director General declared a public health emergency, our highest level of alert, on January 30th, at a time when there were less than 100 cases outside of China. Number 2, support to governments. The World Health Organization has 150 country offices, has done 70 surge missions to hotspots, and has issued more than 40 pieces of guidance, like, for example, the criteria you might use to ease restrictions and lockdowns to governments. Number 3, supplies. We've had solidarity flights with the World Food Program that have delivered diagnostics, for example, testing. Just to take an example, when this started, very few or no African countries could test. Now almost all can. And with partners, 30 million diagnostic tests have been ordered over the next 4 months, or personal protective equipment. 180 million masks, 50 million of the specialized N95 masks have been ordered and will be delivered with partners. Number 4, training. 1.5 million enrollments of health workers in online training programs on COVID. And number 5, research and development. WHO has launched solidarity trials, so we do the trials of treatments more quickly together and get to those answers together. And just today, with many partners, including heads of state and foundations, launched the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, which aims to ensure fast tools, including a vaccine, and to ensure that that's equitably distributed, because science is the exit strategy.
James, let's bring you in. Much of the criticism that we're hearing sort of comes down to a single question, which is, was the WHO too slow in calling a global pandemic? It strikes me that that is only important if an earlier warning on the ground might have actually changed things. You know, from your position, would it have?
Well, I think it's extremely important to recognize that there's two sort of major issues here. One is that this is a new virus. This is a new pandemic. And the state of knowledge at any point in time is evolving. And the state of science is evolving. The definitions are evolving. The understanding of the particular meaning of a cluster of new pneumonias, this is evolving. So that's really important to understand. The second is that the nature of relationship between institutions and governments is also evolving. And we're at a point now where the interdependence of our world, economically, politically, socially, environmentally, this is virtually inescapable now. And I think this is really this is a sea change moment for the entire world in terms of recognizing the degree of interdependence. If you remember, only in December of last year, we had wildfires across Australia. And for many, this was a moment where they recognized, wow, climate change is real. And yet, even at that point, that wasn't enough to push the world into a recognition of our mutual interdependence. I think this pandemic has done that. And again, from a whole range of perspectives, economic, political, scientific, and so on. So to try to make some sort of retrospective diagnosis about, who knew what when, first of all, this is not the time to be doing that. And secondly, it's not particularly a useful approach given this new reality.
I mean, I guess I understand the point that it's early to be having these sorts of conversations. I think it's clear, though, that those conversations are happening even today. You know, we saw it with the Canadian Parliamentary Committee asking Bruce Aylward if he can testify. I think Dr. Tedros has to allow that to happen. Ilona, let's bring you in. What do you think about all of this kind of debate swirling around what the WHO should have done when and how well?
Well, Danielle, I think it's incredibly straightforward. First of all, the WHO doesn't just act. It has a rule book according to which it has to act, and those are the international health regulations. Those international health regulations were negotiated in 2003, 2005. They came into force 2005, and it was the countries that negotiated them. So the countries set the rules. WHO follows the rules. The first step in those rules is point one, that all countries need to be prepared for a pandemic. We know from international analyses, independent analyses, the Global Health Security Index, that most of the countries did not follow their requirements under the international health regulations. Point one. Point two is a country has to notify the World Health Organization. It has a responsibility. China notified WHO in end of December, 31st of December. WHO then started to inform its countries because, you know, each country has an international health regulation focal point. That is a requirement of the international health regulations. And WHO started in early January, I think around 5th of January, to start informing all countries something is happening. Around the 8th of January, and that goes back to James' point, we started to know what it was, a new coronavirus. And then by the 12th of January, that virus was sequenced. So in all that period and all throughout January, countries were informed by the World Health Organization something is going on. Take your pandemic plans out of your drawers and look if you would be prepared if something really serious happened. Then already, and Peter alluded to it, on the 30th of January, around 500 cases worldwide, including the Chinese cases, WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. That triggers what countries should be doing. And if you do an analysis, and I'll end with that, if you do an analysis, most countries started to act mid-March. They waited 6 weeks until they took this outbreak seriously. And there we have a real problem.
Yeah, it is, I think, important to note, right, that for everything that the WHO does, what it doesn't have the ability to do is to sort of force policy compliance on governments. How much, Peter, do you think of the criticism that's being centered on the organization right now is a kind of shoot the messenger reaction?
Look, I think the key issue here, Danielle, is where we started this discussion, what lies ahead of us. And a strong WHO is essential to defeat COVID-19 and save lives. So I think that's really has to be the focus. Ilona talked about the January timeline, which was essentially warning early and often. Throughout February, there were regular press conferences 3 times a week, where the commonest theme from Dr. Tedros was the window of opportunity is narrowing. I mean, there was consistent warning and consistent support on behalf of on the part of the World Health Organization. Having said that, after any major public health crisis, and this is the largest public health crisis in a century since the influenza pandemic of 1918, after any major public health crisis, one does an after-action report. WHO has made clear it welcomes transparency and accountability. Dr. Tedros actually referred to it as an open book. But to do that now, when hundreds of thousands or millions of lives are at stake, is, as a colleague of mine said, cutting off the right hand of a surgeon in the middle of an operation.
I guess the U.S. is kind of forcing your hand, though, right? And this brings us to the issue of defunding. America's contribution to the WHO represents about 15% of its budget, I think. What kind of contingency plans are in place to deal with that enormous hit that you're going to have now that Donald Trump has said that the U.S. is going to defund?
Maybe Ilona might.
I can maybe say a word or two here. I mean, of course, the WHO has to do its calculations, and maybe Peter wants to say something. But it's quite clear, point one, we'll have to see what the legal situation is in the United States, how Congress will react, et cetera, et cetera. There's all of that. And there's 2 types of budgets. There is, of course, the assessed contributions. If the US no longer pays those, then it is actually breaking its responsibility in terms of treaty law of belonging to the organization. The other part is if it doesn't pay its voluntary contributions, then, for example, a global program like polio eradication will be severely threatened. So while, creating this notion we will stop our money for a sort of abstract bureaucracy is not what this is not what this is about. So I think the thing that is happening is, and we're seeing this very clearly in Europe, that a whole range of European countries is moving into contingency plans. They are talking to their finance ministers, the heads of state, they are talking to their parliaments, etc. So you can rest assured that the time is over where everybody thinks that the United States is able to totally threaten and destroy this organization. Definitely Europe wants to save this organization. Africa wants to save it. They believe in this organization and they will act accordingly. And this afternoon, Peter alluded to video. Everybody does this per video now. There was a big video meeting on this access to COVID tools. There were about 6 to 10 major heads of state who were clearly saying we're behind the organization, we're behind it politically and financially. So there's a lot going on, and we will see that the world is not going to take this lying down.
All right. Peter, I do want to bring you in on this. I'm not sure how much you can say about what the WHO's response is going to be moving forward on this. I'd at least like to ask you whether or not the organization was surprised by the U.S. move, because I would have thought, given some of the rhetoric that had been coming out of the United States, sort of in the month leading up to the decision, that there may have been some discussions within the organization, within Geneva, about the possibility this could happen. Were there?
Well, Danielle, what Dr. Tedros has said is that the World Health Organization regrets the decision of the United States, and it's reviewing the situation to ensure that its activities can continue uninterrupted. The UN Economic Commission for Africa, for example, a couple of days ago released a report that projected between 300,000 and 3.3 million deaths in Africa from COVID-19 in the future, depending upon how we act. The World Health Organization is a key part of that, and that's what's at stake. What I would say, though, is the United States has incredible scientific power, strength, capacity. It's always been a very close partner and a good friend of the World Health Organization. And many technical experts from the United States have actually been part of this response as well. But to come back to the headline here, this is the worst public health crisis in a century. Lives are at stake, and a strong WHO is essential to defeat COVID-19.
It seems like
Daniel, if I could just add.
Yes, please.
Ireland, on the day that Mr. Trump made his statement about cutting American funding, Ireland immediately said it is going to quadruple its contribution to the WHO because it recognizes that WHO is vital to the global interests, the global public health interests. And in my view, Canada should be doing exactly the same. Not only quadrupling its contribution as an act of solidarity with that global institution, but it should also be, in addition to core funding, it should be stepping up with a very significant amount of money, in the order of $100, $150, $200 million to support the WHO in terms of dealing with the next wave of COVID, which it's underway. And there are literally millions of people's lives who are at stake here. And the last point that I'd like to make is I think it's time to change the focus here. This is not about, some little inquiry. This is about a global pandemic that is threatening the lives and the well-being of literally billions of people in terms of impact, and it poses a deadly threat to millions of people around the world. The WHO, as a technical and as a convening institution, is absolutely vital today and for the next year at least in terms of managing this pandemic. Let's focus right there, right now.
And in terms of the $200 million idea that you just floated out coming from Canada, James, Are you aware of any sort of traction behind that idea in Ottawa?
Well, I'm not at liberty to discuss that in any significant way. It's not my purview. It's not my responsibility to make commitments of that kind. But it's certainly my opinion that is what is necessary at this point.
And Danielle, can I just come in and say that some European countries are doing exactly this, right. That these are the kind of figures they are talking about. And that also I indicated on the 4th of May, there is going to be a big fundraiser organized by the European Commission. The G20 has already started a fundraiser also to support WHO and particularly the research dimensions. So, what is really interesting, we've been in other situations where there's been a lot of talk, but it wasn't followed by action and it wasn't followed by money. And this time around, we see that many of the leaders, many of the heads of state are saying, this is really serious and we're going to act and we're going to put our money where our mouth is. So if Canada, I don't know, what Canada's doing, but if Canada were to ask around its European friends, it would hear a lot of examples.
And Danielle, if I may just put that in context, we always talk about the expenditure side and we're talking about hundreds of millions, but let's look at the economic damage here. I mean, as you know, trillions of dollars have been wiped from financial markets. But what's worse, and this is in contradistinction to the financial crisis, is this is actually about the real economy. The real economy is at a standstill. And that means that people who depend on work for their daily bread, the vulnerable, as well as all people, are suffering terribly. And what's at the heart of that economic problem is a public health problem. And what's at the heart of the response to that public health problem is the World Health Organization. And so it's really hundreds of millions compared to trillions. And the lives and livelihoods of people around the world that we're talking about here. And that, I think, gives context. And I think it is why many are stepping up to support the World Health Organization, as Ilona was just saying.
The other big story that's been getting more and more traction in recent days has been the possibility that China covered up the extent of the problem and that the WHO was too soft on China for, I've seen all kinds of speculations about why that may have been. Peter, let me ask you about that. I mean, given how much noise you were dealing with in the early stages in those first few weeks, how confident are you that you were getting a proper picture of what was happening on the ground?
Danielle, the WHO has 194 member states, and it treats them all with independence, with impartiality, and with fairness, with neither fear nor favor.
Ilona, I want to ask you the same question, essentially. Should the WHO have been more critical of China's response? Do you think that there was a cover-up?
I don't think there was a cover-up. I think there were definitely problems in China in November and December. Between the regional level of China, the Wuhan province, etc., the central level, etc. I mean, WHO becomes important the minute this untypical virus, this untypical disease is notified, which I said, was end of December. WHO then also traveled to China, was in contact with Chinese colleagues, and I've already told the other story. What I think some people don't realize is that, first of all, the international health regulations put restrictions on the WHO, how much, they can research in a country. It's got to be fully agreed to by the country, point one. Point two, that WHO will never call out a country. And I think Peter, in a very diplomatic way, was trying to allude to that. And WHO is subject to the kind of communication that UN agencies that try to ensure that all countries work together and with each other that they keep that level of communication. But you can rest assured, and I think communications or evaluations will show that there are two levels of the work of WHO. One is, of course, how it has to keep countries together and it doesn't name and shame. But on the other hand, how it communicates one-to-one with a country and its decision makers. And don't forget that the Director General himself got on a plane to talk with China about the situation, to be briefed by China and to brief them what his intention was. He briefed China on the outcomes of the first committee about, should a public health emergency of international concern be declared. And he had, a very long one-on-one with President Xi. And he came back, and the next day he declared the public health emergency of international concern. So I think something is being built up here. It also relates to some of the earlier things you said. WHO is being used as a pawn in a geopolitical conflict. We're going to see that several countries didn't quite do what they were supposed to do, but WHO does not have the power either to call out China or to call out the United States for that matter.
Information, I'm going to bring you in, James. Information, though, like throughout this pandemic has been so critical. And it strikes me that those are two pretty big vulnerabilities. The fact that, in a sense, the WHO is only as good as the information it gets from the countries that are providing that information, and the fact that it won't call out a country if that information is lacking. James, how significant has that been, in your opinion, in terms of affecting maybe the ability of some other countries to act quickly in the way they could have?
Well, it's a very, it's a highly theoretical question, right? I mean, the reality is that the WHO exists in this conundrum between the self-interests of nation states and the common interest of global health. In order to fulfill its obligations or its mandated obligations around common interest, it requires the full cooperation and willing cooperation of each nation state. Now, it has no ability to verify in the heat of a particular moment as to whether or not full information is available. So, this is just the reality of the construction of the institution, of the post-World War II architecture. Here we are, right? But the world has changed significantly. Our context has changed. And the interdependence that we exist in and the timeliness of that interdependence, the short timelines requires that we need to revisit this. We need to revisit this governance structure. And that will definitely happen. I am absolutely assured that will happen. And we also need now, today, to keep our eye on the ball. And right now, we are just ramping up in terms of the major impact of COVID in the global south and in situations of complex humanitarian emergencies. And the WHO, its expertise is absolutely vital to an effective response in those circumstances. And I would very much welcome, from an academic and from a practitioner perspective, I would very much welcome a WHO that is unencumbered in terms of its ability to focus on the ball right now. Peter alluded earlier on to where we are in terms of the pandemic. We've seen a first impact in Asia, followed by an impact in Europe, followed by an impact in the United States. And now the impact, and each impact has been incrementally higher. And it's been incrementally higher because the preparedness of each of those three regions has been incrementally slower, right? And so the issue now for the global south, and again, for circumstances of complex humanitarian emergencies like the Middle East, North Africa, the Congo, the Chad Basin, the triangle of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. These are really, really vital areas where there is very little preparedness, and so at this time, the focus for the world should be on enabling institutions like the WHO, like OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the World Food Program, and so on, to be able to respond effectively to help those nations and those communities that are profoundly at risk today.
Yeah, James, I'm going to
Danielle, could I please come in?
Sure.
The thing is, I agree with everything that James said, but I do want to say very clearly, WHO informed all countries mid-January and provided them with technical guidance how to respond to this virus mid-January. In January, it's called a public health emergency of international concern. And most countries, except those countries that had lived through SARS, South Korea, Taiwan, etc., most countries didn't lift a little finger to prepare themselves. Let's just be very clear about that. And then, we can do all kinds of evaluations. I was part of the independent evaluation team after Ebola 14-15, where WHO responded too late. And we clearly said that. And it was part of the international community's debate. And based on that, there was reform of WHO, and the new program that now runs was established. What was not done, and that relates back to one of the points James made, countries did not want to touch the international health regulations because they did not want to give the WHO more teeth in investigating and in working in countries as soon as there was an international emergency. And I think now that's one of the most serious things we have to do, is to say, let's revisit those international health regulations with one proviso. What will we get if in the present geopolitical situation, we open the discussion on this instrument, an international treaty, mind you, and in the present geopolitical situation, we might not, because of the blame games that are going on, actually get the stronger instrument that James spoke about, but will actually get a weaker one because some of the actors want a weaker WHO than we have right now.
James, what about, seeing this as potentially an opportunity to bring China more into the international fold in terms of using its clout in the global health space? I'm thinking of the fact that, you've had so much experience on the ground in Africa, which Peter has already alluded to the fact that, the consequences of this virus there are potentially devastating. Africa is clearly an area where China is increasing its heft all of the time. Rather than focusing on what the U.S. is not giving, should China be seen as an opportunity?
Well, I think the journal Science, which is the top scientific journal in the world, the journal Science, the editor of the Journal of Science recognized, I believe I read it 2 or 3 days ago in an editorial, recognized that even in their journal, the best science that has been published around COVID over the last 12 weeks has virtually a very significant percentage, greater than 60%, has been from China, right? And has involved Chinese scientists. So I actually think that the opportunity here that matches the need, right? It's not just simply about some theoretical idea about who did what when. This is about urgent need. The opportunity that matches the need is really around science and is really around the critical issues. This virus, there is no treatment, there is no vaccine. We do not know the nature of immunity, what form that immunity will take. We don't have definitive science on that yet. And there is also the very real reality of mutation of the virus. and the form that that mutation will take and the impact that that mutation will take in terms of human health and well-being is unknown at this time. So the science is absolutely critical to how we approach the next phase of managing this global public health emergency. China is central to that. The scientific community globally has been central, in fact, to openness, right? And to actually understanding the nature of data, understanding the nature of governance and how that influences our scientific process and how it influences our global public health process. So I think one of the key opportunities here that matches the need, and that's the issue. I'm not interested in theoretical debates. The opportunity here is really around science. One other example, China has engaged in some very radical, and I don't say that in a judgment-oriented way. They've engaged in some very radical approaches to containment and control and to quarantine. Now, many of their methods I would not use and I would not recommend, but the science indicates very clearly that quarantine and containment and control measures are highly effective, right, in reducing the spread of the virus. Now, there are really, really important, again, not just theoretical, but practical questions around the implications of that knowledge for example, lockdowns across the developing world, where this is having huge impacts, not just simply in terms of containing the virus, but also huge impacts in terms of increasing economic insecurity, increasing food insecurity. And it has led to, for example, OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, to say very clearly, even 3 days ago, that we risk famines of a biblical proportion, so that by the end of 2020, this year, we may see upwards of 265 million people who will be in need of food assistance. Now, these are not theoretical considerations. These are practical. And engaging China and its scientific community and its public health community with the broader global public health and scientific community around these questions, this is where we need to focus.
I want to bring in a couple of questions from the audience. We've received a lot of them. A number of questions, Peter, go back to the issue of funding, U.S. funding. This one puts it well. Will Donald Trump's defunding of the WHO lead to a cascading effect, whereas other U.S.-aligned nations also defund it? If so, what is the future of the WHO as a whole? I know we've sort of touched on this, but if you can just speak a little bit more about the impact of that defunding on the organization.
Sure. I mean, I think that, today I saw a video from Chikwe, the head of the Nigerian CDC, who said that the WHO was, quote unquote, critical to the collective survival of humanity, or words to that effect. And that's the point here. And so you can be confident that WHO will do everything it can to support countries to save those lives. And that is really the bigger picture here. And it will do it with partners. James spoke very eloquently about food security as a knock-on issue here. And Dr. Tedros has called for national unity and global solidarity. And I think we all appreciate, for example, what Canada has been doing in terms of its support to the World Food Programme, its support to WHO, and its obvious support for the multilateral system. We will not defeat this virus alone, or countries cannot defeat this virus alone. We must all act together with global solidarity, and that's how I would answer your question. We must defeat COVID. We must save lives. The WHO is essential to that, and countries must act with global solidarity, and I think they will.
Danielle, if I can just come in with some concrete countries. I mean, who are the next biggest funders of the WHO?
I was going to ask
you that Melinda Gates
question.
Foundation, it's Germany, it's the United Kingdom, it's France, and it's the Nordics, and partly Japan. And all of those have already expressed their full support of WHO, have already activated additional funding for the WHO and are out there motivating the others. So at least at present, we have a significant basket of all the major funders of WHO, except the United States, who are actually supportive of the organization. So the domino effect, well, I doubt it.
And it's not just nations, right? The second biggest contributor is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which donates almost 10%. I wanted Ilona to specifically ask you about this. When did sort of billionaire philanthropy start playing such a huge role in funding this organization, and is it a good thing?
Well, it started to play a role at the turn of the century. It was, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was created around 2000. It selected health as one of its key areas. It started to support a number of other organizations then also as they were created. It even helped create them, like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. But it is very interesting because at the beginning of the creation of the Gates Foundation, they actually thought they could do it alone. And it was one of the great revelations for Bill Gates that if he really wanted to have impact, he should partner with the WHO. So that has been, a really significant movement. It is, by the way, historically not new. The Health Office of the League of Nations, because the United States did not join the League of Nations. If you remember, the Health Office of the League of Nations was mainly financed through the Rockefeller Foundation, who was as big as the Gates Foundation then as they are now. And they, again, work particularly in these disease-based programs. And I might add that the Gates Foundation is one of the largest funders of the polio program, which is now, a program of significant partnership. But they have seen alone as a foundation, they can't do it. They need the World Health Organization as a partner.
Ilona mentioned polio, Peter. I think that's where the biggest share of the budget actually goes, 27% to polio eradication. There's a list, obviously, of all the many things the WHO does. Emergency preparedness, though, prevention and control of disease outbreaks, relatively small on that list. It's a 100-year event, I guess, what we're seeing right now. But in retrospect, should that budget have been significantly higher?
Dr. Tedros speaks of this cycle of neglect and panic. And it's true. It's very hard to have investments in preparedness because your success is something doesn't happen. But I think now it should be clear to everybody that we have to get out of that cycle of neglect and panic. And it's very important for countries to be prepared for not only to respond to COVID-19, to be prepared for future pandemics, and to build strong and resilient primary healthcare systems, which is underlying everything. Diagnostic tests don't just deliver themselves. You need a strong and resilient primary healthcare system to have preparedness, to have testing in emergencies, to have surveillance. And so that all fits very tightly. It all fits very tightly together. And yes, to answer your question, Danielle, sadly and unfortunately, I think that will be much more evident to everybody now.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be, just looking through the questions, we're seeing it in Canada right now where there's already a post-mortem happening on the long-term care facilities, right? And what should have been done was poorly done. There seems to be this sort of like reflexive need amid all of this, I think, to point out the blame or point out the failings. As all of you, I think, have been making clear in this, we're still right in the middle of the fire. So I think I'd like to sort of start to bring this to a close by focusing on that and where we are right now. We have a lot of very specific kind of medical related questions that are on everybody's mind right now. One of them, if I've had it, am I immune? How immune am I? For how long? There's a lot of lack of clarity around some really key questions. Peter, what are the most important things that we need to learn from now?
Well, the single most important thing, Danielle, is the development of a safe and effective vaccine. And hence that launch by WHO, by the Gates Foundation, and other partners, many heads of state today, of the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator is very important. We need a vaccine, and we need it to be equitably distributed around the world. Science is the exit strategy from this. And without that vaccine, we will be living with the virus. Therapies are also very helpful. In HIV, for example, we don't have a vaccine. We have highly effective therapies. And most people with HIV live completely normal lives with those therapies, which is very different when I saw the initial patients with HIV as a doctor in 1984, early 80s when I was doing my internship. It's a complete reversal. But the vaccine is really the exit strategy. That's the main thing we need to know. And we need to know a lot of other things. The serology you mentioned, the immunity. And this is the value of WHO. It collates information about those critical issues from every study around the world, accelerates them, synthesizes them, and provides guidance to countries. I mean, do we really want to be looking forward without that function and all the other things I mentioned, the distribution of supplies, the training of health workers, and so on? We need to work together to really defeat COVID-19, and it's going to be a tough fight, unfortunately.
Ilona, there's been, including today, so much talk about second waves, about third waves. Clearly, the way this progresses around the world is going to be patchy, depending on all kinds of factors, including social distancing. How do we now start to return to some semblance of normal life? And what will that look like?
Well, I don't think there is a normality, because as long as we don't have a vaccine and as long as we don't know more than we know right now, also about transmissions, etc., you raised the issues, James raised the issues, we will need to lead our lives differently, full stop. And that's why a lot of people are using this term new normal, that we do need to learn, how we relate to each other, how close we get to each other, whether, we do go to a football game every second weekend, how we party. There's a lot of things, and that is why it's so important for the responsible people, for the public health people, the politicians, etc. And we're not even talking about the economic impact now, but they have to have an open conversation with their population. Because the worst thing that can happen is that countries do not trust their governments and the information that they give them. And governments in periods of uncertainty have to be honest about uncertainty. And, from the questions that you raised, it's very clear people want to know every little iota detail of what can I do, what can't I do, what should my neighbor do? And this is, I think, the biggest challenge of governments right now. Be open with your population, advise them according to the best scientific knowledge that we have, but warn them and tell them the normal, or what we considered normal before this outbreak, is not going to be part of our lives again very soon.
And Danielle, sorry, just 10 seconds before you go to James. Building on that idea of trust, leadership is vital here. And I just want to say, I've seen this response at WHO every day, up close, personal, firsthand, up front. And I just want to say that what I've seen is incredible leadership by people at WHO and incredible leadership by Dr. Tedros that's calm and principled and focused on the most vulnerable and saving their lives.
So many of the questions are very granular that we're getting, should I be retested after 14 days of quarantine? Like a lot of, it speaks, I think, to still how much uncertainty there is to Ilona's point around transmission. Bloomberg published a story yesterday, James, saying it now looks like almost 14% of the population of New York State may have infection markers, meaning they've had it. That would significantly change the fatality rate. What do you need to know? What do you need answered going forward? If we start from the assumption that everybody wants a vaccine, what else?
Well, I think so just to build on what has already been said, we need a very clear focus on scientific cooperation globally. We also need a very clear focus on equitable access and funding to diagnostics, to vaccines, and to treatments. We also need a very clear focus on the multidimensional nature of this global public health crisis. It's not simply a virus. It is a virus primarily that is having profound impacts in terms of public health, in terms of economic stability, in terms of food security, and in terms of the stability of societies around the world. So we need a comprehensive approach that recognizes that complexity. And then finally, I think the other big thing that we need, which is really where we started, we need a commitment, which we have, to lessons learned. And what does that mean in terms of future emergency preparedness? And I would just conclude by saying that the concerns, for example, of people in New York are exactly the same concerns of the people in Zambia, Malawi. And so the WHO, for the people in, for example, Zambia, Malawi, the WHO is one of the most trusted organizations in the world because it is seen to act in the common interest, not in the self-interest of any one nation. And so, this is our shared challenge. This is our shared problem. We will get through this. There is no question about it. The only question is when, and that really hinges on our commitment to our common self-interest.
I'm going to ask you all to end with 30 seconds. Same question, James. I'll start with you. Increasingly, as we go forward, I think there's going to be more and more stress being put on public safety versus economic health. How do we maintain some sort of semblance of public safety while also having some semblance of economic health? If we were to come back and talk to you a year from now, what do you think things will be looking like? Where will we be?
Well, my optimistic scenario would be that
Let's end with your optimistic scenario.
We would have taken the advice of the various people of Peter and Ilona on this panel. That we do recognize that this is our common challenge, that this is a multidimensional challenge. It requires cooperation. It requires a commitment to truth, right, and not to a lack of clarity. And it requires a commitment, literally, to each other as human beings. And that is our start. That must be our starting point, and it must be our end point. Without repeating what I've said previously, those 3 or 4 points, I think that's the path forward.
All right, Ilona, the same question to you. I mean, if we do everything that you've all advised, if the WHO is not massively defunded by other countries rally behind it, as you've said, is already happening, and everyone cooperates and shares science, a year from now, how much hope can you offer?
Well, I would hope that we use this opportunity to also think a lot, because I made this allusion to the new normal. And we can see that some countries and some cities, for example, are using this to actually restructure how they work. How they organize their traffic. We see that some countries like Denmark are using it for new financial rules, saying the state will not support you if you have offshore, offices and you avoid tax in this country. So I would hope that in terms of how we organize our society, we don't just economically, health-wise, and in the way how we relate to each other as human beings, we don't just go back to how we were before, but we really draw a lesson to be more mindful of each other, to be more mindful of how we live together globally.
Peter, I'm a bit squeezed for time. I was going to end a few minutes earlier to hand back to Mike, but I do need to get you on this last question as well before I do that. What do you think?
I'll be very brief, Danielle. To be honest, it's impossible to predict, but it's very possible to hope. And that's what we should do. History will judge us by how we work together within countries, across countries, and how we work together to fight this virus. And it's going to be a tough fight. And if we work together, we will prevail.
All right. Peter Singer, Ilona Kickbusch, James Orbinski, it has been a pleasure speaking to all three of you. And I want to thank our audience as well for bearing with us as we did this remotely and sending so many good questions, most of which I couldn't get to. I promise to bring this in on time. I'm going to hand it back to Mike Van Solen now for some brief closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks everybody for this. This is a wonderful discussion. I know I understand the WHO so much better than I did before this, and I think I also understand the importance of a global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the role of the WHO, and the need for countries to support this organization that is doing its level best at an unprecedented time to deal with a health crisis. So yes, Ilona Kickbusch, Dr. James Orbinski, Dr. Peter Singer, thank you very much for contributing. In many ways, the Empire Club, it's a simple idea. Let's bring together really smart people to deal with the big issues of the day, and we feel we've certainly done that today. To Danielle Bochove for leading the discussion, thank you so much. Everyone, be safe, be well. This meeting is adjourned.